Hi, everyone. We're going to give it a couple of more minutes, see if we get any late stragglers coming in, and we'll start in probably about 3 after the hour or so. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Today we'll be covering oversharing in Microsoft 365. Basically, the idea behind what you're experiencing with some data exposure through normal use in the Microsoft 365 SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams environments, and we'll go through kind of how that happens, some of the risks that pose, and then how to kind of take a look at it. I am, as you saw briefly there when Zach zipped through, Dave Kleist, our Director of Operations here at BlueNet. And with me, of course, is Zach, who is our Senior Solutions Architect and Developer, and will be joining me here on the presentation today, going through some of the details. So, we've gone ahead and covered the introduction. So the next topics that we'll kind of go through in the presentation is to talk about just, how is it that data is getting exposed, really just kind of showing how easy it is. Microsoft makes it for you to share your data inadvertently with a number of people. Some of the additional risks associated with that, in particular, especially with the interest around Copilot and some of the additional challenges that use of Copilot can present in these kind of scenarios. And then also, what are the other risks associated with oversharing in Microsoft 365. Then we'll wrap up with how do you actually, an approach for remediating those situations and going forward and how to work with that. And then we'll have a summary. As always, if you have questions, feel free to post something in the Q&A or in chat, and we'll get to it by the end of the session. So, getting started. What Microsoft is making it easy to see your stuff. So the idea here is how are things getting exposed? And really what it is that some of the easy one-click ways that folks have about sharing information that actually opens it up to more of an audience than perhaps people expect. So examples of that would be if you've ever created a link to a document or a folder where you said, well, anybody that has this link or in my organization can see it. Well, that means basically everybody does. In particular, there's no limitations, even if the person that you had meant to share it with let me back up. So even if you didn't mean to share it with everyone, someone who wasn't involved can eventually find that kind of item. Public teams. So if you have someone joining a public team space, they can go in, sign up, and browse unnoticed because it is public space. So there's no limitations there about being invited or having to be granted permissions to see anything in there. So if you have public spaces in there, anything that's within that space is actually going to be visible super easy. So for example, new hire comes on, you can actually add them. They're going to end up seeing stuff that's public out there that maybe just people forgot it was there, and they can see that. Another example, guest accounts. So if you've actually shared stuff externally or added an external ID to, say, a conversation, a lot of times those guest accounts are left open, really haven't been turned off. So perhaps you were working with a partner that had a deal, and you've gone through and completed that exercise and moved on. A lot of times, people forget to turn that stuff off. Someone gets inquisitive, they start poking around, they may be able to find some of that stuff again, come back in after a certain time, and look and see things that were unexpected. And then lastly, just as another example, is the idea that, as you add someone to a site, all of the past content is visible. So the history is all there for them to actually see. That's the easy way to do it when you add someone. So that means if you had thought that perhaps earlier conversations weren't going to be there, they can actually go back and look at that history. So in the context, when we talk about some of the risks, the most important one that's kind of brought this back up again here in the last 6 to 12 months is the use of Copilot. So as we said in the agenda there, Copilot is probably the nosiest kid in the neighborhood. It will see everything that you see as a user. So if you are actually running Copilot, an agent under your identity or just interactively with Copilot, anything that you have permissions to see, Copilot will see as well, even if you don't know that you can see it. So a good example is going back to some of those public shares that we had. There may be stuff out there that you have that's accessible, but you're not aware. Copilot will be, because it's very aggressive in what it's going to consume to resolve some of the prompts that you have been feeding it. So if it needs the information to resolve that, it is actually going to go out and search through all the things to find what it's looking for. And while it's doing that search, there aren't any really, by default, any guardrails on what it does with that. There's no default protections on data. If you've not gone through and set up like sensitive data types or set up any sort of data loss prevention policies, Copilot is just going to see all of that then. So by default, it's, hey, I just got a license, I'm going to start doing stuff. Odds are pretty good. There are no guardrails for what Copilot is going to actually go access and incorporate into its results. And then lastly, for those shops that are actually working with Copilot agents that do have a separate identity, you still have that public access issue. So anything that has been like shared with anyone in my organization or has been added to public sites, that's all going to be accessible to Copilot as well. And a lot of this really comes up because of that aggressive behavior in resolving the prompts. Whereas like someone will go, this is a folder of, family pictures. I'm not going to go look at it. Obviously, it doesn't mean to be there. That doesn't mean anything to Copilot. If it's out there to consume, it will consume it. So.
All right. So as Dave mentioned, over the last 6 to 12 months, we've seen this a few times live in practice. I've come across some of this while just working on proof of concepts and kind of playing around with things, which ultimately led to us having this webinar today. So going back to the very first thing that we talked about, the anyone with link or anyone in the org sharing links, I've found that is the repeat and worst offender that have been getting people into problems. So some scary stories. An employee can browse a profile for shared files and potentially find, in this case, salary and review information if the files are not protected. So how does that happen? I'm going to share my other screen here, and give you an example of how easy this is and how easy it is to potentially prevent a lot of it. So none of us know why Microsoft makes the decisions they make on how some of their default values get set. However, when you set up a tenant, your sharing settings are the most permissive, which again, there's business reasons for that. And this could stay here. The problem is the default down here is set to that. So choose the link, choose the type of link that's selected by default when the users go to share a file or folder. The default link is everybody in your organization. So if you have not changed that and you're going to take one thing away from this webinar, go to your SharePoint Admin Center, check your policies, sharing, and make sure that this is set to specific people. That way it's going to force the user to type somebody's name in or make a deliberate action to choose this because it does need to be that way. Or there's the other option where you can type in somebody's name. So ours is set correctly. However, if it was not, anytime any user that has edit rights goes to a file and right clicks on it and says share or copy link, the default for me is people with existing access. Had I not changed that default, this would have been what happened. So we've seen in cases where that hasn't gotten changed. People have been using Microsoft 365 for years, and all of a sudden, hey, we're finally at the point where we want to make an intranet. Great, that makes total sense. How the problem got discovered. Here's an example. I've got just a seasonal test user with read access, no ability to make changes to anything. I'm on my demo department. If I scroll down, so over the past couple of weeks, I've told Dave to just randomly click on files and share them incorrectly so that we could see how that works for this demo. So as you know, Outlook, Teams, anywhere where there's where there's somebody's email, you get an interactive contact card. In SharePoint, there's a files section. So you can imagine if somebody, say in HR, wanted to share a folder of that month's or that quarter's or years or whatever employee reviews with somebody else in HR, they sent them an email with a link to this stuff thinking, hey, I'm just copying a link, but they actually copied a link that was available to everybody. Again, so for 2 years went unnoticed, right? No Copilot, no interactive intranet content cards, but now we're rolling out an intranet. I hover over the HR director's name just because I'm poking around and checking out the new intranet, and I see my coworker's review sitting right there because of how that link was shared. So you can see here, some of these things might make sense. Sure, like I said, there's a business reason of why you would want to use everybody in the organization, but PTO 2026, probably not something I should be looking at. I'm just a normal user. Why do I need to see Dave's PTO? So you can see how that can compound and present issues. I will flip back to my other screen here. So that's the first one. That same problem kind of is relatable to all 4 of these bullet points. And I kind of touched on that. Even if no user is aware that this happened, either a compliance audit, it could have found this as well. There are third-party tools that people can use to run reports, and it could have found something like that as well as a user. This can get exponentially worse if somebody's account gets compromised. So problem number 1, people internally have access to stuff they shouldn't have access to. That's definitely a problem, but not the end of the world. But once somebody's account gets compromised and now somebody outside, now all of that information that was originally only overshared internally is now outside everywhere. It can get even worse if people are using the sync functionality. Somebody has an entire HR library synced locally to their computer. All of that stuff was shared incorrectly. Now somebody from outside compromises their account. They drop a malicious payload into a folder that they had edit rights into. Everybody else that had that folder synced to their local desktop now gets that malicious file. So guest accounts can also be affected in that same manner, right? The guest accounts that you would have on a team. So again, all of those different types of sharing and the guest accounts, they have a business purpose, but they need to be used with intent, and users need to be educated on when to use what, and go check your defaults. Make sure that those are set correctly. So how do we close the gap? Unfortunately, there is not a great way to do this without the use of a third-party tool. You can go site by site and look at broken inheritance for permissions and look for external access, but you're not going to have a way to get a nice roll-up of just tell me all the links that people have created that have shared internally, externally with the entire organization. There's no way to do that easily. You could maybe get there with some of the compliance stuff or some purview audits, but it's not going to be easy. So we need a process that provides visibility, speed, feedback, and prevention. An example of what we did on a recent client engagement, we were able to run some scans, and these are some screenshots of what it would look like. So it gives you an overview of your environment, how many sites, groups, teams, OneDrives, active users, how much size you have. It can analyze, how many licenses you're not using, give you a savings there. But then we get into the stuff that we're talking about today, oversharing, right? Over 2,000 files and folders can be accessed through people in your org links. All of these can be drillable and remediated on the spot, right? And it also provides the opportunity to have a discussion of what was shared correctly and what was shared incorrectly. So there will be decisions that need to be made when you're going through these to make sure that the stuff that was shared with validity remains. Just a deeper dive into the licenses part. Again, you can click on any one of these and see what those accounts are. Here's the big one that we've been talking about today. So it gives you an example. Again, there's the files that were created with the bad link. There's been 94 objects that have broken permission inheritance. This one could maybe warrant some discussion. Again, there's always going to be a business case for there could be a need to have broken permission inheritance. When I help people set up intranets or document management structures, the idea at the beginning is to try and always architect it that gets you 80% of the way there. And if you have 20% that might need to have some uniqueness, then that's okay. But we want to try and architect these things from the beginning so that they will scale with permissions and we don't just end up with like this 94 different areas. It kind of creates a spider web. But again, out of the box, there's no way you'd be able to do this without some really intense PowerShell scripting. This just kind of breaks down some more of the issues in different content categories. Content sprawl, again, how many SharePoint sites are inactive, how many OneDrives are inactive. Direct permissions, so again, when you share something and you give somebody direct access to it, that's going to call that out. So it's able to give you a roll-up of all of the potential areas that you may have overshared and let you decide if you want to fix them. We can have discussions about them, talk about if your architecture needs to be redone in any way.
So we did have one question come in, Zach. So they asked, what's the best method to teach people how to share correctly?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple in my opinion. It's a matter of showing them what their options are and explaining each one and holding them accountable to it. If I go back to my other screen here. So I'd tell people in a training, there's two ways that you can get a link to a file or share a file. Copy link means if your defaults are set correctly, copy link is always going to say people with existing access. So you truly are just copying the link. You're not changing permissions. You're not giving anybody else access. It's when you click on share, now it's going to default to where I need to type in a name. So making sure defaults are set right and explaining the difference between copying a link and sharing, and then clicking on this and opening it up and explaining what each one of these does and why you might want to use it. Anytime somebody uses this, I would always ask the question, does that file belong where it is? If it's in HR and you're trying to share it with everybody else, maybe that file doesn't belong in HR. Maybe it belongs in your shared drive that everybody already has access to, so that we're not making a permission exception. Again, not always going to be the case, but I would always ask that question. Hopefully that helped answer your question, David. Anything else?
Why don't you jump to the next slide then? I think we've got the summary and contact info. So just to kind of wrap it up, really to minimize your exposure risk, you need a process that's going to provide you a comprehensive overview. What's going on in your environment today, especially if you've been using Microsoft 365 for a number of years. Initially, when we started talking about this, one of the use case examples we talked about overexposure was a result of COVID. So if you think back during COVID, when all of a sudden we went from basically an on-premise to everybody remote, the interest in use around SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive shot way up. And that was pretty fast, pretty quick. And so the idea there is that people kind of built on that. So that is a good example of where, if you've been using it that long, you probably want to have the comprehensive overview as, you probably got years of different habits, different users in there actually doing items. Type thing. So same idea. You also want something that works quickly and is repeatable. If it's going to take you 6 months to do an assessment and figure out what's going on before you can actually remediate, that's not really going to move you very far forward in protecting your environment. You want something that's going to be able to give you snapshots and some feedback relatively quickly. And so that you can kind of start tracking drift. So the same idea is like, you want to have it periodically enough to know that, are we continuing with the good practices? Are we backsliding at all? So you want to have that as well. And then lastly, does it help point out where you may have process gaps? Are there things like, back to David's point, is there something we need to do around user education where we'd want to say, okay, it looks like we need a refresher on a certain number of topics. Related to that, just as we mentioned, we did work with this with a customer. We do have what we call the data exposure review service, which covers all of these topics. If it is something that you're looking for, certainly reach out for details. I did see another question. For organizations that intentionally use SharePoint as a public content repository for website downloads, do you recommend leaving the tenant sharing level at anyone and restricting sharing at the site level? Or do you recommend a different governance model?
Yep, you got it right. You have the ability to, set what's allowed at a tenant level, and then exactly from the site level, you can restrict it from there. So we've had some organizations do that where you'd need to submit a request in order for your sharing settings to even allow external sharing links. You'd have to present a case for them to turn that on at your site level. So that's good.
Okay, maybe drop to the contact page. So do reach out to us if you have any questions. If you're interested in a copy of the document of what we walked through. As always, if you have questions related to that or anything else, feel free to reach out to us or give us a call at our sales number at 952-900-3832. And if you do come up with questions afterwards, feel free to email us. We're happy to respond to anything that comes through. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.